Hey museum friends, it's Nat from the Roberson Museum and Science Center, and it must be Tuesday because we're doing another tour, guys. And today we are in the Roberson Mansion Parlor Room. First to start off, I want us to jump in and talk about what is this parlor room? What does it mean? Why is it here? And then we can jump into talking about how, I guess, women expanded out from the parlor room and why it matters, and why we should have a conversation about it. But first, I'm going to kind of give you a little context for the parlor room and where it sits in the mansion. So right here we have the very grand, very open mansion foyer, and here we have the entrance to the Roberson Mansion. Very nice. And then right off there we have the parlor room. Yeah, we have the mansion parlor room. So the parlor room was very much a public space where people would gather and meet. And the parlor room in the 1900s and even in the 1800s was a symbol, or was a way that you symbolized and announced your wealth and status to the world. Having a parlor room, having this specific room where people could meet and convene, and where you could invite your guests, was a place to show that you had ascended to a new status, which is really interesting, yeah. And so the parlor room, what lives here is art, is very fancy furniture, fine furnishings. This is where you showcased your heritage, your culture. It was your public face, you know? This was your public face to the outside world. But this parlor room was also a place where women were allowed to gather without a man present. Yeah. So the parlor room represented an interesting space for women. So in order to understand that, we have to understand we have to understand gender relationships. So in the 18th and 19th century, there's this idea called the cult of domesticity, which is an idea that involves, that declares that nature uses gender to relegate people to specific jobs. So men were relegated to the public sphere, to business, politics, and women were relegated to the domestic sphere, so the home and the family, children, and the like. And for women, this space was really important, and we know Mrs. Roberson, Margaret Roberson, Alonzo Roberson's wife, would meet here and gather. She would advertise in the society papers, meetings for the Clio Club. We have records of that. So other high society women would gather here during certain hours to discuss Shakespeare and books. Yeah, it's really cool, right? Very beautiful, very fabulous. Would gather here and meet and talk and discuss and socialize. And I also want to turn the camera back around here and show you a really kind of interesting feature that also goes into gender of these spaces and these rooms. So you see this chair right here? So there is, it doesn't have any arms, and it's a little low to the ground. So chairs during this time are actually gendered. Interesting, right? So chairs without arms and that are lower to the ground were meant for women. Gendered chairs, eh? Really, really crazy stuff. And the lack of arms was to make room for more flowy dresses, but it was also to reinforce etiquette during the time. So women were supposed to sit away from the chair back, sit up straight, and hands in their laps. Whereas men's chairs had arms, which gave them a little bit more of a throne-like posture, and they were higher up. Right? Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. But So the parlor was a place where women of high society could gather with one another. And during the turn of the century, in the 1900s, you start to see ideas of where women were allowed to be start to change. And part of that changes because people have more wealth. There's a middle class that has money to spend. And you also start to see women working through industrialization. You see more women out in the world. So people realize that they need to start shifting and changing their ideas of where women are allowed to be. Because it was the case that when restaurants were starting to crop up and more refined places for higher society and maybe middle class folks were starting to crop up, like restaurants, women were supposed to be accompanied by men. They weren't allowed to go with other women unless it was like reserving a private room, very high society stuff. But that was for very wealthy women. So you start to see people challenging this idea. So there's a funny story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter and her friend. They get out of a meeting and they want to go to the Hoffman House in New York City to eat, to go to a restaurant. They want to sit out in the garden. They were in a hot and sweltering place. They want to air out a little bit and enjoy a nice meal. And they are initially seated at the Hoffman House, and then somebody comes up and is like, "Oh, no, you don't have a man with you. We cannot seat you because people might get the wrong idea that you are women of ill repute." She was not having it. She protested. She said, "We're allowed to be here. All women should be allowed in these spaces." And they received pushback and they were thrown out. They had to go find somewhere else to eat. But yeah, and that started to, that incident started a larger conversation about where women were allowed to be and women's rights, and that women should allowed to be in the same spaces as men. And there was actually a rather unfortunate bill that didn't pass, or rather wonderful bill that didn't pass, unfortunately, that declared that people shouldn't be discriminated against, and that everyone should be allowed in the same spaces. Yeah, you can't discriminate. But unfortunately that didn't pass at the time, but ideals were starting to change, fortunately. But it would have been nice to have a bill to protect people just in case. But it was starting to change. And women, especially high society women, were starting to expand outwards into the public space, which is really cool. And especially for women of a certain wealth, they had the income to spare to create extravagant tea rooms where they could invite their friends and where women only were allowed. But once again, there were also certain barriers, So only women of a certain caliber, of a certain wealth and status, were allowed in certain rooms. So you still have these divides happening of where, restrictions of where certain women are allowed to be. But it evolved over time. And women were eventually expanding outwards into certain places, especially like department stores. Department stores started to develop these cafeterias where women could come and hang out and shop and spend more time and spend more money, which was pretty cool. But yes, so industrialization, more women in the workplace, more money to spend, allowed women to expand outwards from the home and out into the streets, and out into the larger world. Though it breaking barriers slowly but surely. So, allowed in the restaurant, but only certain restaurants, but expanding outwards from there. So yeah, and eventually it became common for women to be allowed in restaurants with mixed company, which was wonderful. But there are more complex conversations about also different classes of women. So each each class, and even conversations involving race, where certain women were allowed to be and where certain women weren't allowed to be. So even depending on your income, what you were dressed in, your attitude might have restricted you and barred you from certain places. So while high society women probably had it the best, women of different race or wealth definitely had a tougher go of it. There are cases of women who were coming from the farmlands and going into the cities to seek opportunity. They had to sometimes choose between feeding themselves or having a roof over their heads. There was a case of a woman that regularly appeared as Rose Fortune in the papers. She worked as a laundress for a while, which is a really grueling job. You're working in hot environment, you're lifting and pressing, working with heavy machinery, and there would be cases where women would pass out because all they had for breakfast was maybe a piece of bread. And the places where they were allowed to eat out for lunch, they would typically bring a small pail of food that they would nibble on, but it wasn't enough calories for the calories that they were burning doing their jobs. And on one case, Rose Fortune wrote about one of the more motherly figures in the laundromat, Miss Mooney, she went by. Took them all to the women's entrance of a saloon, gave them a big thing of ale and some soup, and she never felt fuller in her life. But unfortunately, those saloons were largely spaces for men, and a young woman going there alone was to invite certain unwanted attention, unfortunately. So there were different barriers and tiers to, unfortunately, women had to still cross during that time period. But I'm going to kind of end the conversation there, but before we do, I do want to tell you about a really interesting book where I kind of learned a lot of this stuff and was a really great jumping off point for my research specifically for this room. It's called Repast, Dining Out at the Dawn of the New American Century, 1900 to 1910. I highly recommend getting this book. It has some really interesting thoughts on restaurants and dining out and women's rights and other things, and you can learn about all that. But as always, if you'd like to support these videos, and if you have any questions after this video is finished, I'll be sure to type and answer, and if you want more information, I'll be sure to also leave a link to the book down below. But if you want to support these videos, please consider becoming a member of the Roberson Museum and Science Center, or making a little donation. Anything you can do really helps us out. And as always, check out roberson.org. We have tons of amazing activities for you to do at home, and we have places where you can rewatch these tours and learn more amazing facts about this mansion. But I'm going to leave it off here, and until next Tuesday, guys, stay safe, and I'll see you around. Bye.